Hello and welcome back to another video. In this video we're going to go over all the issues you might run into with a cranking no start. So if you have a car that's cranking but not starting, we're going to go over all the possible issues that you might have, and then you could use this video to narrow down your problem. So this is going to be different from a no crank no start. So we're only going to go over a crank no start. All right, so I've written down all four of the strokes here. So intake, compression, power, and exhaust, and then we're just going to go over one by one to see what could possibly be the problem. So like any disturbances in any of these strokes, then you're going to result in a cranking no start. Or if it does end up starting, then it's going to be like a heavy misfire, but we're not going to go over that just yet. All right, so first stroke over here, intake. So any restrictions in the intake when it comes to air. So we have here a clogged air filter could be an issue. That's a bit more rare unless you haven't changed your air filter in years. Okay, next up we have a mass airflow sensor that's dirty. Dirty mass airflow sensor could be messing up the readings when it comes to the air, or sometimes an aftermarket mass airflow sensors, depending on the car make and model, they'll cause a crank no start issue, especially if they're these Chinese Amazon ones or eBay ones. Some of them are not really well built, so they're gonna cause more issues if you install them in your car. So yeah, a dirty mass airflow sensor or an aftermarket one. Dirty mass airflow could cause a really heavy misfire if it does eventually start. But if it's really bad, or if it's a really defective one, then the computer cannot measure the air. The mass airflow cannot measure the air, and it cannot send that input to the computer. So that's why it's going to cause a crank no start. All right, so next up, any disturbances in the intake valve. So if the intake valves are not opening, then that's going to cause a issue in the intake stroke. So any issues with the intake valves, that's going to come from the camshafts, either the camshaft lobes that are damaged, or the camshafts not spinning correctly, not causing one of the cylinders for the intake valves to open, and then or many cylinders, and then it's going to cause a no start because we can't get the air inside the cylinders. All right, and lastly, a vacuum leak. So a big enough vacuum leak will cause a crank no start, because the extra air is going to get past. Again, it's going to bypass the mass airflow, so the mass airflow is not going to measure the extra air that's coming in, and therefore the computer will not be able to calibrate the what's it called? The computer will not be able to put the right air fuel mixture if there is a big vacuum leak. So any vacuum leak inside the around the intake manifold, or any vacuum hoses that are severely cracked, that it's letting in a lot of air, then that's going to cause a crank no start. And also on some cars, a stuck open purge valve will cause that, because a stuck open purge valve will cause excess. It's going to act like a vacuum leak, since it's going to cause excess fuel vapors to get inside the intake manifold, which then is going to get inside the engine, and it's going to mess up the air fuel mixture. All right, so that's going to be it for the intake stroke. Next up, we have the compression stroke. So any disturbances in the compression stroke is going to cause a crank no start. So what we have here is going to be piston rings. So most of these are going to cause the common issue of, well, not common, but the main issue of low compression. Okay, so worn out piston rings, the piston rings are going to help seal the little gap between the piston and the cylinder walls. So if your piston rings are all worn out, then that's going to cause a low compression, and that's going to cause a crank no start if your cylinder cannot build up enough pressure. All right, so if it's not the piston rings that are damaged, it's going to be the one next, which is cylinder walls. If they're all scored up and damaged due to a lack of oil or being washed down by the fuel injectors, then that's going to damage, that's going to severely damage the cylinder walls, and then that's going to cause once again a low compression issue, and that's going to cause a crank no start in your car. So if it's not cylinder walls or piston rings, it could be the one next here, the damaged valves. So either the intake valves or the exhaust valves. So if any of those are damaged, then when the piston is going to come up for the compression stroke, so the air will leak out from either the exhaust or intake valves, and then you're not going to build enough compression in that cylinder, and then yeah, you're going to cause a crank no start issue if you have any damaged valve. And last up, we have timing. So timing is going to be due to either the belt or the chain or the crankshaft position sensor or the camshaft position sensor. So any of these that are responsible for timing, they could cause a crank no start. So for belts, if it's a stretched belt or a belt that jumped, sorry, not the stretched belt, if it's a belt that jumped a few teeth on the timing, then that could cause a crank no start, because your cylinder is not going to be firing at the correct spot. As well as chain, if the chains are stretched, then that could also cause a no timing. Chains could stretch, and also they could skip timing, skip a few teeth, and then that's going to mess up the timing on the power stroke. As well as a faulty crankshaft position sensor, either in the wiring or in the sensor itself. And lastly, the camshaft position sensor. Same thing as the crankshaft position sensor, so either in the wiring or the sensor itself. And that's going to cause a timing issue. All right, next up we have number 3, power stroke. So anything responsible for the power stroke I've listed here, and then any disturbances in that, then you're going to cause a crank no start. So first up we have so spark. So whatever is responsible for spark, so coils or plugs. If your coils are not firing, and if your plugs are worn out, so if the tip is completely worn off, or you know, if your plugs are getting old, then usually you'll replace those two in pairs, and then you could restore your, you could fix your crank no start issue. Usually when people have this problem, that's the first thing they'll go and replace, which is coils and plug. If you have either a misfire or a crank no start, coils and plug are probably going to be the easiest one to replace when it comes to issues like these. All right, next up we have so for coils, it's either going to be the coils not firing, or a wiring issue, either a power or a ground issue with the coils. And then the plugs, it's just a mechanical component, so really if they're bad, then you could just replace them, and then that should fix your issue. All right, next up we have so injectors. So if the injectors are not firing, if it's a completely dead injector, same thing with wiring or just a faulty component, then that's going to cause a crank no start. Even if it's just one cylinder, then yeah, you're going to have a crank no start issue. If it's multiple cylinders, it's a guaranteed. So injector, it kind of falls into the intake stroke, because if you have port injection, then you're firing the fuel as the intake valve opens. But for a GDI engine, I think they fire towards when the piston is coming up for the power stroke. So that's why I put it in the power stroke. So when the piston is coming up for the power stroke, the injector is going to fire. So if you have any issues, like I said, with the injector, then it's not going to work properly, and then it's going to cause your crank no start. And then after that, it's going to be fuel. So all right, so anything with the fuel, so contamination with the fuel, fuel pump being faulty, or I was going to write the high pressure fuel pump, but in some cases it could cause a crank no start issue, but most of the time it's going to be this guy here, the fuel pump. So if the fuel pump is faulty, it cannot provide enough fuel to the lines, which the lines are connected to the injector, and then that's going to cause a crank no start because your engine is not building enough fuel pressure due to a faulty pump. So you need fuel pressure to start the car. So if the fuel pump is still working and then you have an issue with the high pressure fuel pump, then this is going to probably cause a heavy misfire. Since yeah, it's going to cause probably a heavy misfire since the engine is still getting fuel supply from the fuel pump, but not at the pressure it wants. So if a faulty high pressure fuel pump, which pumps fuel pressure at around 2000 psi, depending on the car make and model, some are even more, then that's going to be your issue if this guy is faulty. All right, next up is the last stroke, the exhaust stroke. There's not much to this one. So like I said, with the compression stroke over here, if the exhaust valves are broken, then it's going to cause a compression issue. Mostly you'll have the issue with the exhaust stroke is going to be any back pressure due to clogged exhaust. So any clogged exhaust system will cause excessive back pressure, and that could actually cause a crank no start issue. If it ends up being a crank start and then an immediate die down, so if it dies completely after starting, like immediately after it starts, then I've seen it a lot where it's because of a clogged exhaust. So clogged exhausts are from worn out cat converters. So that's probably the only component that could cause a clogged exhaust if the component in the cat has broken off, and it's going to find its way down the exhaust system and then clog up your either your pipes or your resonator or your muffler, and it's going to cause excessive pressure to go back into the combustion chamber, and then it's going to cause your crank no start issue. So yeah, so the only issue with the exhaust is going to be a clogged exhaust due to a cat or some other some other component, but most of the time it's going to be a catalytic converter that's broken off. All right, and okay, so I hope this video helped fix your crank no start. Okay, so you could use this chart to kind of guide you towards the component that's failing. Testing these components is going to be a different story, especially when it comes to compression or spark and injector. So you're going to have to do, if you're going to need wiring diagrams or pressure gauges to measure fuel pressure or compression pressures in the cylinder. So that's going to be a whole nother story, but this is just kind of give you a basic guide to where to look when it comes to a crank no start issue. All right, hope you guys find this video helpful. Hope you guys find it valuable. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.